truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. Please proceed.
Thank you. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
My name is Dr. Kyle Shaw.
Where do you work?
I currently work as a forensic pathologist in the upstate area of South Carolina, working for several coroner counties in that area.
What do you do for the coroner counties? What do you do on a regular basis?
So I'm a forensic pathologist. My role with the coroner offices is to review cases that are presented to me and provide my opinion of cause and manner of death. In the coroner setting, primarily that involves performing autopsies as part of that process.
Where did you work before you moved to South Carolina?
At the District 5 Medical Examiner's Office in Leesburg.
What did you do for the District 5 MD's office?
I was an associate medical examiner, again working as a forensic pathologist with a similar role, except that I was more directly involved in some of the investigative process and supervising investigators for the office.
How long did you work here in the Fifth Circuit in Leesburg, right?
In Leesburg, for a decade, 10 years.
Can you describe to the jury your educational background and training that allows you to do that job as a forensic pathologist?
I got my medical degree from the University of Sydney in Sydney, Australia. Following that, I did a one-year clinical internship with the Southeastern Sydney Area Health Service, also in Australia. Following that, I returned to the U.S. and did the first 2 years of my general pathology residency training at the Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. Following that, I did the final 2 years of my general pathology residency training at the University of Maryland Medical Center in Baltimore. Following that, I did a one-year subspecialty fellowship in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland. And then following that, I moved down here and took a job.
You're obviously licensed to practice medicine in Florida. Are you still licensed in Florida?
I am, yes.
Can you describe for the jury generally what an autopsy is and what it involves?
In general, in most cases, an autopsy involves both an external and an internal examination. During the external examination, I look at the outside of the body and any clothing or materials that are with or on the body for evidence of natural disease or injury. I then move to the internal examination, where we examine the internal organs of the head, neck, chest, abdomen, and pelvis as part of the routine we call full autopsy. And during the internal examination, again, I'm looking for evidence of natural disease or injury and trying to correlate those findings with the external examination as well as any investigative information that we have at that time.
Can you estimate about how many autopsies you performed in your career?
On the order of over 3,500 at this point.
You mentioned earlier the term forensic pathology. What is pathology, first of all?
So pathology is a medical discipline that focuses on the study of natural disease as well as injuries, but primarily pathology is focusing on natural disease in general terms.
What is forensic pathology when compared to pathology?
So forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology where we focus, again, on natural disease and injury, a little bit more focus on the injury aspect of things, and then applying those findings in a legal and public health setting.
Have you performed autopsies in your career on skeletal remains?
Yes.
About how often?
I would estimate on the order of 50 or 60. Again, there's a variation or a range of decomposition changes that range from early decomposition all the way to dry, disarticulated skeletal remains. And there's a few kind of in the middle there that are partially skeletonized that wouldn't necessarily be considered a, quote, skeleton, but somewhere on the range of 40 or 50 or so.
What do you mean by disarticulated remains?
Disarticulated basically means that's usually very late in the decomposition process where the bones the soft tissue holding the bones together has also decomposed and the bones are separate. They're disarticulated. They're no longer articulated or attached to one another.
Have you performed autopsies on people who have sustained gunshot wounds to the head?
Yes.
About how many times?
Many hundreds. I'm not sure if it's to the thousands, but many hundreds.
Have you been permitted to give opinion testimony in court in the area of forensic pathology before?
Yes.
About how often?
60 or 70 in court.
Your Honor, I ask permission to allow this witness to provide opinion testimony in the area of forensic pathology.
Any objection?
No objection.
Without objection, the request is granted.
Thank you, Your Honor. Let me direct your attention to March 10th of 2018. Did you perform an autopsy on skeletonized remains recovered in the case of State of Florida versus Laurie Shaver?
Yes.
How did those remains get from the scene to your office?
They were transported by one of our forensic investigators from the scene. She was present during the excavation process, and she brought those to the office.
Am I correct? You personally were not present. Your medical examiner investigator was.
Correct.
Where is the medical examiner's office located here in the Fifth Circuit?
It's in Leesburg, so it's on 809 Pine Street in Leesburg.
Is a case number, a medical examiner case number, assigned to each and every autopsy you perform?
Yes.
Is that number unique to the individual autopsy?
Yes.
What was the autopsy number associated with this case?
2018-0428.
Is it customary, and it didn't happen in this case, that law enforcement was present during the autopsy?
Yes.
Were photographs taken during the course of your autopsy?
Yes.
Showing you has been marked as State's Exhibit S for identification. Can you take a look at these images and tell me if you recognize them?
Yes. These are images, it's photographs as well as an x-ray, images that were taken at the medical examiner's office during the course of this examination. Not all on the initial day of autopsy, some are later.
Do those fairly accurately depict the skeletonized remains as well as some of the evidence that was packaged and things like that?
Yes.
This time, State would move S as in Sam into evidence as 19, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection.
No objection. Without objection, State's S will be admitted into evidence as State's number 19.
How were the remains packaged when they arrived in your office?
So they originally arrived in a body transport bag as well as some additional bags basically to help contain the smaller bones.
Were those bags obviously sealed with evidence tape and things like that?
Yes.
What's a body transport bag?
So a body transport bag is a typical, what we call just a body bag, and usually a body, especially if there's any substantial remains involved, will go into that bag and zipped up for cleanliness and privacy.
What was the first thing you did when you received the skeletonized remains?
We start taking photographs. So photographs usually precede the examination, and then of course additional photographs are often taken during the course of examination. As also part of that process, at least in certain kinds of cases, x-rays will be performed.
In this case, did you lay the various bones out in what would be the anatomical position of the human body?
Yes, during the course of examination, those bones, in a skeletal type of case, they get laid out.
Showing you photograph 1 of State's 19. What do we see here?
This is part of the layout of the skeletal remains at the medical examiner's office. So just for orientation, towards the left of the image is the skull, which is on a foam support pad there. And then most of the bones basically going down to about the level of the pelvis.
Photograph 2, what does this show?
This is basically working our way down that same set of remains, just looking at a different area. So this goes a little bit lower. It includes the pelvis and more of the lower extremities.
And photograph 3 of State's 19. What do we see here?
And here we see the rest of the lower extremities. So over on the far right of the image, we see a number of small bones, and those are the smaller bones of the ankles and feet.
Were most of the bones that would normally be contained in the human body recovered?
Yes.
Were any bones missing?
There were a few small bones, predominantly of the hands, that were unable to be located, but very few.
Did the fact that a couple bones in the hand may not have been provided to you affect your ability to do an autopsy in this case?
Not substantially, no.
We've heard something about a humerus bone. Where's the humerus bone in the body?
The humerus bone is part of the arm, or the upper arm. Basically is from where I'm indicating on myself, from the shoulder to the elbow is the humerus.
Did you examine the skull in this case?
Yes.
What did you do to examine the skull?
So as part of that examination, again, x-rays are performed, images are taken, or photographs are taken, and then during the course of that, some cleaning is usually performed. In a case like this, where the specimen or the bones may subsequently go for anthropologic examination, I usually do very little other than, again, some general cleaning and general examination.
Why would you do very little if they're going to go to be examined by an anthropology lab?
So sometimes these bones are very brittle and very delicate, and usually I find that once I'm able to document them, that the anthropologist is more of a specialist specifically in bones. So it's usually valuable for them to see those bones in as pristine a condition as possible. So I'm usually very delicate with what I do have.
You mentioned x-rays were taken. What does photograph 4 of States 19 show?
So this is an x-ray of the skull. Now the lower part of the jaw is absent. It was disarticulated. It's just not in this x-ray. But what we can see is over towards the left and bottom, we see the teeth, just for orientation. And then towards the right of the image, so that red dot was just on the teeth. Now over on the right of the image, there's a bright white spot. That bright white spot is radiopaque material that corresponds to a projectile or bullet.
Showing you photograph 5 of States 19. What do we see here?
So here we see an image of the back of the head, or the back of the skull. This has been rotated around so that the top of the skull is down and the bottom of the skull is up. And right in the middle of that image, we can see a round hole, which represents a gunshot wound, in this case, a gunshot wound of entrance.
Can you point in your own head generally where that gunshot wound was located?
It's approximately here, as I'm indicating on the back of my head.
Did you locate a projectile inside of the skull?
Yes.
And explain how you did that.
So the x-ray let me know that it was there. I was then able to carefully basically reach into the skull. We can't see it in this particular image, but the skull is basically sitting on the top of the spine, and the bottom part of the brain transitions into the spinal cord, and where the brain exits the skull and goes down into the spinal column, there's a hole, and that's called the foramen magnum. And it's on the order of approximately an inch or a little bit bigger in size. So it's a decent sized natural hole in the skull. And I was able to reach in there, feel that bullet, which was loosely adherent but not firmly adherent. It came loose very easily, and I was able to recover that and retrieve it out of the foramen magnum.
Why would the projectile or the bullet actually have adhered to the skull?
So when soft tissue decomposes and begins to dry out, materials sometimes will stick to it. That soft tissue, as it decomposes, forms a little bit of a glue-like substance. So there were just a little bit of residual decomposed tissue that had dried around the edges of that bullet and caused it to basically be loosely stuck there. So it was not rattling around originally, which is why it was first noted on x-ray.
Did you observe any kind of an exit wound or damage to the opposite side of the inside of the skull, as if the bullet entered the skull and hit the opposite side?
So although there were some fractures of the skull, there was no impact site that I was able to identify, nor that the anthropologist subsequently reported. There was no exit wound, and there was no obvious impact site.
Once you recovered the projectile out of the skull, what did you do with it?
That was packaged up and turned over to law enforcement.
Showing you what's been marked as evidence in State's Exhibit M is in man. Can you open that up, look inside, tell me if you recognize the contents.
So the outer bag here has been previously sealed. It has some labeling on the outside that appears to be related to law enforcement's numbers. Inside is a small envelope, and the envelope bears a medical examiner's office label and the medical examiner's office case number of 2018-0428.
Is that the medical examiner case number associated with this case?
It is, yes, and the original, or one of the seals, one of the evidence tape seals has my signature and the date of March 10th, 2018.
And is that in the same or substantially the same condition as when you collected out of the skull? If you need to open it up, look inside, and tell me if you recognize the contents of that package.
Sure. So within this envelope is a bullet or projectile, which appears to be consistent with the same or substantially the same, appears to be substantially the same as the projectile that I recovered in March of 2018.
And I'm also showing you photograph 6 of State's 19. Is that a picture that you took of the projectile you removed?
Yes.
Okay. This time State would move State's M as in Mary into evidence of State's 20.
Any objection? Without objection, State's M will be moved into evidence as State's number 20.
You said obviously the projectile would have entered through the back of the skull. Can you, beyond the projectile traveling back to front, are you able to determine a path of travel and with any other specificity?
Not definitively. One thing to kind of keep in mind when we're doing these examinations is that a typical bullet, has two main profiles. The bullet is a little bit elongated and tends to have a rounded tip, like a little bit of a cone or a rounded cone shape. So when that bullet is facing directly at you, the profile is round. When it is off center or tangential at an angle, so we have perpendicular and we have a little bit of an angle to perpendicular. As it rotates away from perpendicular, it takes on more of an oblong or ovoid shape. So when that bullet enters the skin or skull, when we have a round hole, that tells us that the deviation is not dramatic from perpendicular, from a right angle, because if it is a fairly dramatic angle, then we have normally an oblong or irregular skull entrance. In this case, the skull entrance is rounded. However, because of the absence of the brain, in other words, I can't see the path of the bullet through the brain because there's no brain left, I can't say that it was perfectly perpendicular when it entered, only that there's no clear evidence that it was at a sharp or distinctly sharp angle away from 90 degrees.
During your examination of the brain, of the skull, did you locate any other portions of potential projectile in the brain?
Yes, so the X-ray also shows a few very small pieces or radiopaque fragments, basically fragments that show up the density of metal, which are typical. It's typical for a projectile to break off a little bit or small pieces. So there were additional pieces noted on X-ray.
Did you do anything with those additional pieces that were noted?
Not at that time.
Why not?
They appeared to be firmly embedded either in the bone or on the inside of the skull. So my options would have been to either try to open the skull to get at those, which would have deviated that skull from so-called pristine, or at least in the condition that I had it, and I wanted anthropology to look at that first.
Would it be common that if the anthropology lab noticed that, they would, when they were finished, remove those items and send them back to you?
Yes.
Did you locate any finger or toenails in the remains that were provided to you?
Yes.
Showing you photograph 7 of State 19. What does this show?
That is a sampling of fingernails or toenails that were recovered from the body bag, from the materials that were provided.
Photograph 8 of State 19. What does that show?
Additional fingernails or toenails that were recovered.
And did you package those fingernails and toenails up in the 2 bags we've seen in the picture?
Yes.
Show me what's been marked as State's Exhibit O for identification. Can you open that up, look inside, and tell me if you recognize the packages?
Sure. This is an additional paper bag that has some labeling on it that appears to be from law enforcement. The bag appears to be currently sealed. Within the bag are 2 small envelopes bearing the medical examiner's office labels and case number of 2018-0428. And my signature is on the seals.
Can you open those up, look inside, and tell me if you recognize it?
Sure. So within our dry material that appears to be the same or substantially the same fingernail, toenails in one of them. As well as the second one.
This time, State would move State's O into evidence as 21, Your Honor.
Any objection?
No objection, Judge.
Without objection, State's O will be admitted into evidence as State's number 21.
Now, Doctor, in case I asked a bad question earlier, you mentioned that you found the projectile that you recovered as well as some projectile fragments that were embedded in the skull.
Yes.
You're not saying that those are from 2 separate projectiles, are they?
Correct. It's consistent with just being from a single projectile. The projectile that was recovered is partly deformed, and during the course of deformation, it is possible that a portion of that metal broke off during the course of entering the skull or impacting the skull.
Is it common for when a projectile hits a hard object like a skull for it to fragment or break apart?
Yes.
You've seen that a lot of times in your career, haven't you?
Many, many times, yes.
You mentioned the anthropology lab a few minutes ago. Were these human remains that were brought to the medical examiner's office packaged up and sent to an anthropology lab?
Yes.
And how are they packaged up and how are they sent?
So originally they were packaged either in a box or bag and physically brought by our investigator to the Pound lab. So Investigator Griffiths drove them up on, I'm just referring to the investigator's report, which is part of the medical examiner case file. On March the 22nd, those were received by, I'm also referring to the anthropology report, March 22nd of 2018. They were transported up by Investigator Griffiths. Later that day, still on March 22nd, the lab contacted us back and said that a femur was available to be returned to us.
Okay. into the femur in a second. Where was this lab located that the remains were transported to?
The lab is associated with the University of Florida, so they're in Gainesville.
You mentioned the term pound lab. What is that?
So it often just gets called the, quote, pound lab, but it's the CA Pound Human Identification Laboratory, so it's sometimes also called CAPHIL, but it is a lab that is associated with the University of Florida.
And they do their own analysis. You're not a part of that analysis, right?
That's correct. We provide them information that we have, the investigative information that we have, and we'll discuss the case, but they do their own analysis of the bones themselves.
You said a few minutes ago that the pound lab people sent you back the femur.
Yes.
First of all, what's a femur?
So a femur is the major bone of the thigh. So between the hip and the knee, that big bone is called a femur.
And what was the purpose of you getting the femur back?
So the plan at that time was to take that bone, release it to law enforcement, and law enforcement would then send it to a laboratory for DNA analysis, mainly for identification purposes. Excuse me.
Is the femur a good source of DNA for some reason?
It is a common source, and the longer that a skeleton has been out, the more bone sometimes is needed to do an analysis. And I don't perform those analyses, so I can't comment on exactly what they need, but it is common for them to ask for either a piece of bone or the entire bone. And again, they usually have better results if they're able to look at the entire bone and not have to go back and forth with us to get more bone later.
So the plan was you guys are going to get the femur back, and that femur is going to be sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in whole for DNA analysis.
Correct.
Okay. How did the femur come back to your office?
So that was packaged up at the Pound Lab on the 22nd. We received it by FedEx on the 23rd, March the 23rd, and then I examined it, or it was examined, the package was examined, I believe on the 24th, March 24th of 2018.
Take photos of that piece of evidence and things like that.
Yes.
Showing you photograph 9 of states 19. What do we see here?
So this is the FedEx package label, and up in the upper left-hand corner, maybe a little bit difficult to see, but in the upper left-hand corner is a handwritten date of March 22nd, 2018, which is the date that they informed us they were packaging that item up. And then towards the bottom, you can see another label that is typed. It says 23rd of March, which is part of the FedEx shipping identification labels.
You said you got it the 24th of March?
We received it, I believe, on the 23rd. It may have been late in the day.
And photograph 10 of states 19. What do we see here?
So this is the outside of the box. This is the outside of the box that contained the femur. This is actually, I believe, after we repackaged it. You can see the date there of the 24th, where it had been resealed in order to be released to law enforcement.
Photograph 11 is the bottom.
Yes, that's one side of the box.
When you opened the box, when you received it from the Pound Lab and opened it up, what was inside?
A femur, and it was packaged and sealed. There was an additional seal on the inner bag packaging.
Okay. Was there also a letter inside from the Pound Lab?
Yes.
Did that basically just indicate they're returning the femur?
Yes. So this is our opening that box originally as it came to us from the Pound Lab, which included a very brief letter from the Pound Lab regarding their limited examination to that point.
And photograph 13 of states 19, what do we see as we get further into the box?
And that is the femur within packaging from the Pound Lab.
Photograph 14.
Additional image of the femur having been removed from that box.
And we see some writing on the bag. It says 3C18 bag 1 of 1. Do you know what that means?
3C18 is the Pound Lab case number for this case.
Okay. Did you eventually get a report from the Pound Lab?
Yes.
Did it have that same case number on it?
Yes.
Did the report also mention the femur was returned to your office?
Yes.
Does all that documentation clearly indicate the femur returned to you was the same femur that you sent to them?
Yes.
Okay. Photograph 15 of states 19, what does this show?
So this is that femur outside of the bag. The bag was open for us to take additional photos. Again, just documenting that it was in the same condition that it was when we had released it the previous 2 days earlier, I believe.
Photograph 16, is that just the other side of the femur?
Yes, we just rolled it over.
And photograph.
And that's the femur with that received packaging label.
Now, to your knowledge, was this femur sent to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement for analysis?
That is my understanding, yes.
And was it eventually returned back to your office, the medical examiner's office?
Yes.
When was that sent back to you? Actually, a better question. Did you receive it?
We did receive it back. Again, I'm referring back to the medical examiner's investigative report on June 22nd, 2018. It was received back from Detective Dorier to our office.
Was it still packaged in the same box that you sent it off?
Yes, that box had been repackaged and resealed.
Showing you photograph 18 of States 19. What does this show?
That is the box that we received back. And again, we can see at this point we can see additional labeling has been added. You can actually see the original or the earlier March 24th number towards the bottom left of the image from when we had sealed it previously.
Now it has the yellow Florida Department of Law Enforcement sticker on it.
Correct.
And photograph 19.
That's a
Law Enforcement, or that's the Florida Department of Law Enforcement sticker.
yes.
And photograph 20. What do we see?
This is the femur inside that package, and we can see in this image at least two, or actually I believe three, areas where bone had been removed for DNA purposes. One is toward the top of the image. Yep, there's actually a little piece that's missing on the ball at the very, very top of the image, a piece towards the upper quarter of the image, a piece towards the bottom, and in a different angle there's actually a fourth area that had been cut into, again, by the lab for the purposes of DNA.
Except for those areas of the femur that were cut away for purposes of DNA analysis by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, was the femur in the same or substantially the same condition as when you received it initially, when you sent it to the lab, when you got it back from the pound lab, and when you sent it to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes, other than those areas, it appear to be substantially the same.
Showing you what's the marked in States Exhibit P is in Paul. Does that box look familiar?
Yes, it does.
Is it the same box we've been seeing in all these pictures?
It does appear to be, yes.
Can you open it up, look inside, tell me if you recognize the contents?
So the seals appear to be intact at this point. There's quite a lot of tape on it because of the repackaging, multiple repackagings. And within are some bags, including the bag with the pound number of 3C18, as well as the femur. Yes, it appears to be, again, with 4 areas that have been cut into for the purposes of DNA.
Time state with States Exhibit P is in Paul into evidence is 22.
No objection.
Without objection, states evidence in states number 22.
And with the court's permission, may the doctor just publish the femur to the jury showing the areas that were cut away?
Granted.
So this is the femur, the front part of the femur, the back part of the femur, and we can see an area that's been cut away in the ball or head of the femur, an area here on the proximal shaft, the upper part, an area on the distal shaft down here, and an area down here basically at the knee.
And none of those areas were present when you first saw the femur, correct?
Correct.
So it's not like those were caused by some kind of trauma or gunshot wound or anything.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. Did the medical examiner's office eventually receive all of the bones and the human remains back at your office from the pound lab?
Yes, we did.
You mentioned earlier that during your x-ray you saw those projectile fragments from that projectile embedded in the skull and you didn't do anything with them.
Correct.
Were those fragments removed by the anthropology lab and sent back to you?
Yes.
And how were they packaged?
They were separately packaged with the remains that came back to us.
Showing you photograph 22 of States 19. What does this show?
So that is a bag with the fragment within it that has the pound lab case number 3C18, and you can see that it's sealed at the top.
Photograph 23 of States 19. What does this show?
That is upon initially removing the fragment that they recovered.
And did you actually remove it?
Yes, I would have removed it from that bag.
And what happened when you removed it after you?
So between taking that photograph and turning it over to take an additional photograph, it fragmented.
Just broke apart?
It just broke apart. Gentle manipulation, it's just a very small, thin, brittle piece of metal in that case.
Showing you photograph 24 of States 19. What do we see here?
So that's the same fragment that unfortunately had broke apart during manipulation and prior to repackaging.
Showing you what's been marked as States Exhibit N as in Nancy. Can you take a look at that item, open it up, and tell me if you recognize the contents?
Yeah, so it's currently there's a outer plastic bag which has an evidence label, a court evidence label on it. Within that bag is a manila envelope which has the medical examiner's office label and case number of 2018-0428 on it. My signature is present on one of the seals. And within there are fragments that appear to be substantially the same as the last image taken and displayed on the monitor there.
Your Honor, at this time the state would move N as in Nancy into evidence as 23.
Any objection?
No objection, Judge.
Without objection, States N will be moved into evidence as States number 23.
During the course of your autopsy, did you examine all of the bones that were provided to you?
Yes.
Except for that single gunshot wound to the back of the skull, did you locate any other trauma to either the skull or any other bones you examined?
Not that would be considered trauma at or around the time of death, or what we call perimortem trauma. There was some damage to some of the ribs. However, that was interpreted as post-mortem trauma.
Meaning after death?
Meaning after death.
So, did you locate any evidence of a chip or a break in any of the other bones as a result of trauma, either being struck or another gunshot wound or something like that?
No.
At this time, we're going to allow the jurors a comfort break, so we'll break for about 10 minutes. Okay, thank you.